What would make an elite American Green Beret, a Fort Bragg instructor with 2 Bronze Stars, abandon his own unit and beg to serve as a simple rifleman under Australian command? What did he witness in those jungles that the Pentagon buried in classified files for 32 years? This is a story the American military establishment desperately wanted you to never hear. 1968. Vietnam. A decorated U.S. major walks into an Australian Special Air Service camp and does the unthinkable. He strips off his rank, sets aside 12 years of American training, and asks the Australians to teach him how to really fight. 47 days later, he returns a completely different man, 14 kilograms lighter, a full beard, and carrying a report so explosive that it was immediately stamped top secret and locked away for 3 decades. Why? Because what he discovered shattered everything America believed about its military superiority. The numbers alone should have caused a scandal. Australian SAS teams were achieving kill ratios of 234 to 1. American Special Forces in the same jungles? Less than 50 to 1. The Australians lost 17 men in 4 years. American elite units lost thousands. Same enemy. Same terrain. Completely different results. How is that possible? What were the Australians doing that Americans couldn't or wouldn't do? The answers are disturbing. The methods are controversial. And the cover-up that followed reveals just how far military institutions will go to protect their pride, even at the cost of their own soldiers' lives. Today, I'm going to tell you the full story of Major Robert Gruning, the American officer who went native with the Australian jungle ghosts. You'll learn the secrets of the the phantom warriors who made the Viet Cong afraid to sleep. You'll discover the Aboriginal tracking techniques that turned ordinary farmers into apex predators. And you'll understand why the Pentagon considered this knowledge so dangerous that they destroyed one man's career just for writing it down. Stay until the end, because what happened to Gruning after he submitted his report will make you question everything you thought you knew about military loyalty and institutional truth. This is the classified history of Operation Walkabout. And it changes everything. On the 16th of March, 1968, deep in the jungles of Phuoc Long Province, something happened that the Pentagon would prefer to forget forever. A United States Army major, holder of 2 Bronze Stars, an instructor at Fort Bragg with an impeccable service record, did something that by American standards bordered on professional suicide. He refused command of his own unit and requested to serve as an ordinary rifleman in an Australian Special Air Service Regiment patrol. Not as an observer. Not as a liaison officer. Just another number in a 5-man team of wild Australians, whom American generals privately called kangaroos with knives. But this decision would trigger a chain of events that Washington tried to bury for 3 decades. This man spent 47 days with the Australians in the jungle, and when he returned to Nui Dat Base, his own command failed to recognize their officer. He had lost 14 kilograms, grown a beard, and had completely changed his manner of movement. But most importantly, he brought back a report that was immediately classified as top secret and remained sealed for 32 years. What did Major Robert Francis Gruning see in the Australian jungle that forever changed his understanding of warfare? The answer would cost him everything he had built in 12 years of military service. The year 1967 was a turning point for American special operations in Vietnam. The Pentagon faced an uncomfortable fact that no amount of propaganda could conceal. American Special Forces units were suffering losses at a rate 3 times higher than their Australian counterparts operating in the same areas. MACVSOG teams, considered the elite of the elite, lost an average of 18% of their personnel per operation. Australian SAS patrols operating in equally dangerous zones lost less than 2%. These numbers sent shockwaves through the highest corridors of military power. How could a small contingent from a country with no jungle warfare tradition outperform the mighty American war machine? The answer to this question became an obsession for Pentagon analysts throughout 1967 and 68. They studied equipment lists, training schedules, personnel files. They compared budgets and logistics. They analyzed everything except the one factor that actually mattered. And that factor was something American military culture was fundamentally incapable of understanding. Major Robert Gruning was not a random choice for this mission. He had spent 12 years in Special Forces, commanded an A-team in Laos, and participated in over 40 combat operations. His reputation as one of the best tacticians in the 5th Special Forces Group was beyond question. When command needed someone to study Australian methods firsthand, Gruning was the obvious candidate. He arrived at Nui Dat in February 1968, full of professional skepticism. His first report dripped with American condescension. He wrote that the Australians seemed competent but limited in resources and technology. He planned to spend 2 weeks studying their methods and return with a report confirming that American tactics simply needed minor adjustment. Those 2 weeks stretched into nearly 7 weeks, and the report he eventually wrote bore no resemblance to what the Pentagon expected. The first shock came on Gruning's very first day at the Australian base. He was accustomed to the bustle and noise of American fire bases, the constant roar of helicopters, the thunder of artillery, the chatter of radios. Nui Dat struck him with its silence. Australians spoke in whispers even in their own camp. There was no music, no loud conversations, no television. The officers' mess operated under rules that seemed absurd to an American. No clinking of utensils, no scraping of chairs. Every movement was calculated to produce minimum sound, but the reason behind this silence would shake Gruning to his core. When he asked why such precautions were necessary kilometers from the front line, the Australian commander replied with a question that would haunt the American for years afterward. He asked how the major expected to be silent in the jungle if he could not be silent in his own home. This philosophy of total silence permeated every aspect of Australian SAS operations. What Gruning learned next seemed impossible by American standards. Australian patrols could go 10 days without uttering a single word. All communication was conducted through hand signals, of which the Australians had developed over 200. Before each patrol, the team would synchronize their watches and establish movement schedules so precise that they could operate as a single organism without any verbal communication. American patrols typically lasted 3 to 5 days and relied heavily on radio communication. Australian patrols lasted 2 to 3 weeks and maintained radio silence, except in emergencies. The difference was not just tactical, it was philosophical, and it was about to get even more disturbing. What truly shocked Gruning was their approach to movement. American doctrine taught speed and aggression. Get in fast, hit hard, extract quickly. Helicopters were the backbone of American special operations, allowing teams to cover vast distances and strike where the enemy least expected. The Australians viewed this approach with barely concealed contempt. Their patrols moved at a pace that defied military logic. The average distance covered by an Australian patrol was 800 meters per day. Not per hour. Per day. They moved in complete silence, stopping every few meters to listen, observe, and sense the jungle around them. Every step was placed with deliberate care, avoiding twigs, dry leaves, anything that could produce sound. Where American patrols crashed through the jungle like bulls, Australian patrols flowed through it like water. Gruning was invited to observe an Australian patrol departure. What he witnessed contradicted everything Fort Bragg had taught him. The 5-man team spent nearly 4 hours covering the first kilometer from base. They moved in single file, each man placing his feet exactly in the footprints of the man ahead. The patrol leader used a walking stick to feel the ground before each step, probing for anything that might crack or rustle. When they reached a stream crossing, the patrol spent 45 minutes observing before one man crossed while the others provided overwatch. This was not caution born of fear. This was something far more calculated. This was the methodology of hunters who understood that patience, not firepower, was the key to survival. The results spoke louder than any doctrine manual ever could. Australian SAS patrols had a contact ratio that defied statistical probability. They achieved surprise in over 90% of their engagements, compared to less than 50% for American units. But the kill ratio was what made Pentagon analysts choke on their morning coffee. Their average stood at 234 enemy casualties for every Australian lost. American special forces in the same operational areas averaged less than 50 to 1. These numbers were not propaganda. They came from after-action reports that Pentagon analysts pored over with growing disbelief and, in some cases, outright resentment. How could 500 Australians outperform tens of thousands of American special operators? The answer lay in a secret the Pentagon refused to acknowledge. American special forces were trained to fight. Australian SAS were trained to hunt. The distinction might seem semantic, but it represented a gulf in tactical thinking that no amount of equipment or training could bridge. American operators saw the jungle as an obstacle to overcome, a hostile environment through which they must move quickly to engage the enemy. Australian operators saw the jungle as an ally, a concealing mother that would protect those who understood her ways. But there was another element to Australian success that Washington found even more uncomfortable. The Aboriginal influence on Australian SAS methods was something the Pentagon never fully appreciated and certainly never publicized. From the earliest days of the regiment's formation in 1957, the Australian SAS had incorporated Aboriginal tracking and bushcraft techniques into their training. Several Aboriginal trackers served with Australian forces in Vietnam. Their influence extended far beyond merely finding enemy trails. They taught the Australians to read the jungle as a living document, to notice bent grass that indicated recent passage, disturbed spiderwebs that revealed human presence, the behavior of birds and insects that could warn of ambush. American forces relied on technology. Australians relied on senses that their Aboriginal instructors helped them develop to preternatural levels. Gruning witnessed this capability firsthand during his third week. What he saw would haunt his dreams for decades. He was accompanying a patrol led by Sergeant Kevin Mitchell, a farmer's son from Queensland who had served 3 tours in Vietnam and earned the nickname Ma Rung from the Viet Cong. The phrase translated roughly as jungle ghost, and it was not a term of affection. Local Viet Cong commanders had placed a bounty on Mitchell's head equivalent to 3 years' wages for a Vietnamese peasant. The sergeant had confirmed 47 enemy eliminations in his career. Intelligence estimated the true number exceeded 100. He accomplished this not through aggressive action, but through an approach to warfare that seemed almost spiritual in its patience and precision. On the 4th day of the patrol, Mitchell suddenly raised his fist in the halt signal. The team froze instantly, Gruning included, though the American had seen nothing to warrant concern. They remained motionless for nearly 20 minutes. Mitchell was studying something invisible to Gruning's eyes. Finally, the Australian sergeant pointed to a tree some 30 meters distant. Gruning looked, but saw nothing unusual. Through hand signals, Mitchell communicated that there was a sentry in the tree, perfectly camouflaged but betrayed by a single detail. The way the leaves moved on one branch was slightly different from the surrounding foliage. Human breathing was disturbing the pattern. What happened next would stay with Gruning for the rest of his life. The patrol spent the next 2 hours maneuvering into position without the sentry's knowledge. They moved perhaps 50 meters in 120 minutes, a pace that would have been unacceptable to any American commander. When they were positioned, Mitchell gave the signal and the team opened fire simultaneously. 3 enemy soldiers ceased to exist in less than 3 seconds. The sentry and 2 other fighters who had been concealed nearby were eliminated before they could raise their weapons. But what shocked Gruning was what happened next. The patrol withdrew without exploiting the contact, without searching bodies, without calling for extraction. They simply faded back into the jungle as if they had never been there. This was standard Australian procedure, and the logic behind it was terrifying in its effectiveness. The goal was never to fight a battle. The goal was to make the enemy afraid to move through his own jungle. The psychological dimension of Australian operations was something American doctrine completely neglected. The Australians waged a deliberate campaign of terror against the Viet Cong in their operational area. They never advertised their presence, but they made certain their presence was felt in ways that eroded enemy morale. Patrols would sometimes spend days simply observing enemy camps without engaging, gathering intelligence, and more importantly, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When they did strike, they aimed not for maximum casualties but for maximum psychological impact. A single well-placed elimination at an unexpected moment was worth more than 100 casualties in a conventional battle. The reason was simple but profound. It demonstrated that nowhere was safe. Viet Cong documents captured after the war revealed the extent of this psychological success. Local commanders reported that morale in areas patrolled by Australians was significantly lower than in areas facing American forces. The difference in how enemy soldiers described fighting each nationality was striking. Soldiers who had fought Americans described the experience as terrifying but comprehensible. Americans came with helicopters and artillery, made tremendous noise, and eventually left. You could hear them coming, prepare for their assault, and know when they were gone. The Australians were different. They made no sound. They appeared from nowhere, struck with deadly precision, and vanished without a trace. You never knew when they were watching. That uncertainty destroyed men faster than any bombardment. The Americans called their doctrine search and destroy. The Australians privately called their approach hunt and harvest. The difference was not merely semantic. It was the difference between a soldier and a predator. Gruning's 5th week brought him into direct operational participation. What he experienced shattered his remaining preconceptions. He was attached to a patrol tasked with locating a Viet Cong battalion headquarters that had evaded American search operations for over 4 months. Previous American efforts had included B-52 strikes, helicopter assaults, and MACV SOG reconnaissance. None had produced results beyond wasted ordnance and occasional casualties among the searchers. The Australians were given 3 weeks to accomplish what American technology had failed to achieve. The patrol departed Nui Dat on the morning of March 1, 1968. 7 men, including Gruning, carrying everything they would need for 21 days in the jungle. No resupply, no extraction unless emergency dictated. No support beyond what they carried on their backs. American patrols in the same area lasted 3 days with helicopter resupply every 24 hours. The contrast could not have been starker. Where Americans relied on the umbilical cord of air support, Australians cut themselves free from the machine and became part of the jungle itself. The first week taught Gruning what true patience meant in jungle warfare. The patrol covered barely 4 kilometers in 7 days. They moved with a deliberation that bordered on geological. They established observation posts overlooking trails and waited. Hours became days. Days blurred together in an endless routine of watching, listening, and waiting. Gruning, accustomed to the frantic pace of American operations, initially struggled with the inactivity. His training screamed that they should be doing something. Anything. The Australian patrol leader, a lieutenant named Thomas Hargreaves, explained the method through hand signals and brief whispered consultations. They were not waiting for nothing. They were waiting for the jungle to tell them where the enemy was. Every trail had patterns of use that careful observation could reveal. Every waterway had crossing points that concentrated movement. Every cleared area had overlapping fields of fire that protected something valuable. The Australians were reading these patterns, building a mental map of enemy activity from dozens of tiny observations. A bent branch here indicated recent passage. Disturbed undergrowth there suggested a concealed path. Bird activity along a ridgeline revealed where humans were not present, which suggested where they might be concentrated instead. It was like watching master detectives solve a crime by examining evidence invisible to untrained eyes. On the 9th day, the puzzle pieces came together. What they revealed left Gruning speechless. Lieutenant Hargreaves gathered the patrol and, in using a stick to draw in the soft earth, outlined what their 9 days of observation had revealed. The enemy headquarters was not where American intelligence had predicted. It was located almost 3 kilometers further north, concealed in a valley that aerial reconnaissance had dismissed as too exposed for occupation. The Australians had determined this through pure inference and observation. By noting which areas the enemy avoided and which trails showed heaviest use, they had triangulated the only possible location. The headquarters had to be positioned to control those trails while remaining concealed from the air. There was only one location that satisfied all observed parameters. American forces would have called in an airstrike and hoped for the best. The Australians had a different plan entirely. The patrol spent the next 4 days approaching the suspected location with patience that defied military convention. They covered 3 kilometers in 96 hours, moving only during brief periods when jungle sounds were loudest, and stopping completely at the slightest sign of enemy activity. On the 13th day, they reached a position overlooking a small valley. What Gruning saw validated every uncomfortable lesson the Australians had taught him. The Viet Cong battalion headquarters lay spread before them, perfectly concealed from air observation, but completely visible to eyes at ground level. American pilots had overflown this position dozens of times without ever suspecting what lay below the triple canopy jungle. Millions of dollars in aerial reconnaissance had missed what 7 patient men found by simply watching and waiting. But the Australians did not attack. Their next decision shocked Gruning even more. They observed. For 3 full days, they watched and recorded everything. The command structure, the communication patterns, the supply routes, the security routines. This intelligence package would prove more valuable than any body count, allowing subsequent operations to systematically dismantle the enemy network, rather than merely temporarily disrupting it. When the patrol finally withdrew on the 19th day, they had accomplished more than 4 months of American operations, without firing a single shot. But Gruning's education was not yet complete. The most disturbing lesson still awaited him. On the return journey, the patrol encountered a Viet Cong courier, moving alone along a trail they had been observing. Standard American procedure would have been to capture the courier for interrogation, or eliminate him and search for documents. The Australians did neither. They let him pass, and the reason why revealed the true depth of Australian thinking. Hargreaves explained the logic in whispered fragments that carried the weight of years of hard-won experience. The courier was more valuable alive and unaware than captured or eliminated. His regular passages confirmed the location of the headquarters. His timing revealed communication patterns. His continued existence meant the enemy would not suspect their security had been compromised. If the patrol eliminated him, the enemy would know someone was operating in the area and would change their patterns. The Australians were playing a longer game than American doctrine ever contemplated, thinking in weeks and months rather than hours and days. This strategic patience explained the extraordinary kill ratios that had puzzled Pentagon analysts for years. Australian SAS did not fight fair. They refused to engage in anything resembling equal combat. They spent days and weeks preparing each engagement, learning patrol patterns, identifying leaders, waiting for the perfect moment when surprise was total and victory was assured before the first shot was fired. American forces, conditioned by their doctrine of aggressive action, often engaged enemies at disadvantage, accepting casualties as the price of initiative. Australians refused to pay that price, and the results were devastating. They would abort operations rather than accept unfavorable odds. They would wait for weeks rather than force a premature engagement. They would let 10 opportunities pass to find the one that guaranteed success without loss. The casualty figures Gruning included in his classified report told the whole story. In nearly 4 years of operations in Vietnam, the Australian SAS suffered 17 personnel lost to enemy action. 17 men in 4 years of continuous combat operations in some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. American special forces operating in the same period and similar areas lost thousands. The disparity was not due to luck, equipment, or enemy focus. It was due to a fundamentally different understanding of warfare. Gruning returned to Nui Dat on April 2, 1968, a changed man in ways he struggled to articulate. His body showed the obvious effects of 7 weeks in the jungle with minimal rations and maximum exertion. But the deeper changes were invisible. He had witnessed a form of warfare that made his American training seem crude and wasteful. He had learned that firepower was not the measure of military effectiveness. He had seen that patience, properly employed, was deadlier than any weapon in the American arsenal. Most troubling of all, he had begun to question whether the American way of war was fundamentally flawed. The report he submitted on April 15, 1968, ran to 147 pages. Its recommendations would have revolutionized American special operations. Gruning advocated for a complete restructuring of American doctrine along Australian lines. He recommended longer patrol durations, smaller team sizes, reduced reliance on air support, and intensive training in silent movement and observation techniques. He suggested that American forces could reduce casualties by 80% while increasing effectiveness by a similar margin. His evidence was overwhelming. His conclusions were irrefutable, and the Pentagon buried every word of it. The report was classified as top secret and quietly shelved. The reasons for this suppression were complex and deeply rooted in military institutional culture. American doctrine was built on a foundation of technological superiority and aggressive action. The entire military-industrial complex was structured around providing the firepower and air support that defined American operations. Admitting that a small Australian contingent had developed a superior approach would have been institutional suicide. It would have undermined billions of dollars in procurement programs. It would have challenged the fundamental assumptions that guided American military policy. It would have embarrassed generals and defense contractors alike. It was easier to classify the report and hope that no one would ask uncomfortable questions. Gruning's military career effectively ended with that report, but not through any formal punishment. He was transferred to a training position at Fort Benning, removed from operational command, and allowed to complete his 20 years before being quietly retired. His efficiency reports, once stellar, became filled with phrases like "quote 9" and "quote 10." These were career-ending codes in the military bureaucracy, and everyone who read them understood exactly what they meant. He never spoke publicly about his experiences with the Australians, bound by classification restrictions that remained in effect long after the war ended. Only in the late 1990s, when portions of his report were finally declassified, did the full story begin to emerge. But by then, the damage had been done. The lessons that could have saved hundreds of lives remained locked in classified files for decades. Throughout the remaining years of American involvement in Vietnam, the patterns Gruning had identified continued to produce predictable results. American Special Forces suffered casualty rates that would have been considered catastrophic if applied to conventional units. MACVSOG, the elite of American Special Operations, lost over 50% of its operators during the course of the war. The Australians, employing methods that Gruning had tried to introduce, maintained their extraordinary effectiveness until their withdrawal in 1971. The lessons that could have saved hundreds of American lives remained victims of institutional pride and bureaucratic inertia. Some of those lessons eventually filtered into American Special Operations, but it took disasters to force the change. The transformation that began in the 1980s and accelerated after Somalia in 1993 incorporated many principles that Gruning had advocated decades earlier. Modern American special operators received training in silent movement, extended patrol techniques, and observation methods that would have been familiar to the Australians of the Vietnam era. Whether these changes were influenced by the suppressed Australian lessons remains a matter of debate. The men who served with Gruning during his 7 weeks in the Australian bush mostly survived the war, but few emerged unchanged. Lieutenant Thomas Hargreaves completed 4 tours in Vietnam before returning to Australia, where he struggled for years with the psychological effects of his service. Sergeant Kevin Mitchell, the legendary quote 11, was gravely wounded in 1969. He spent 18 months in hospital before being medically discharged. The Aboriginal tracker who taught Gruning to read the jungle's signs returned to his people in the Northern Territory, and refused for the rest of his life to discuss his wartime experiences. These men developed one of the most effective approaches to counterinsurgency warfare in modern military history. They received almost no recognition for it. The rivalry between American and Australian Special Forces was never publicly acknowledged, but its echoes persist to this day. Veterans who served in both communities still debate the relative merits of their approaches, usually over beers at reunions where outsiders are not welcome. The question of which approach is superior has never been definitively answered. Perhaps it never can be. But the story of Major Robert Francis Gruning offers a lesson that transcends tactical debate. It demonstrates that military excellence is not measured in equipment or budget. The most sophisticated technology cannot substitute for human skill and patience. Sometimes, the greatest victories are won not by those who fight hardest, but by those who know when not to fight at all. The classified file on Operation Walkabout was fully declassified in 2003. By then, most of the participants were elderly men, and the war they had fought seemed as distant as ancient history. The file revealed what those who had read it in 1968 already knew. A small contingent of Australians had developed an approach to jungle warfare that surpassed anything the mighty American military could achieve. American institutional arrogance had prevented these lessons from being learned until years later, at the cost of countless lives. One American officer, brave enough to admit that his country's methods were not the best, had seen his career destroyed for telling the truth. Some truths are too uncomfortable for institutions to accept, no matter how many lives might be saved by acknowledging them. Major Gruning passed in 2017, at the age of 84, in a veterans' hospital in San Antonio, Texas. His obituary mentioned his service in Vietnam without elaborating on its most significant chapter. The file he created, the lessons he tried to teach, the methods he advocated remain largely unknown outside a small circle of military historians and special operations veterans. The Australian SAS veterans who taught him never received the recognition they deserved from their American allies. The story of what happened in those jungles, of what one American learned and tried to share, of how institutions protect their pride at the cost of their people, remains one of the great untold stories of the Vietnam War. But the most uncomfortable truth might be this: the lessons Gruning learned are still relevant today. In Afghanistan and Iraq, American special forces once again encountered enemies who knew the terrain better than any foreign invader could hope to learn it. Once again, technology and firepower proved insufficient against opponents who understood that patience was a weapon and invisibility a shield. Once again, the institutional emphasis on aggressive action produced casualties that alternative methods might have prevented. Whether the lessons of Vietnam, of the Australian ghosts who taught an American officer what true excellence meant, have been fully learned, remains an open question. The classified files have been opened. The veterans have spoken what they will speak. The truth is available to those willing to seek it. The question is whether anyone is truly willing to listen. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment today stands as one of the most respected special operations forces in the world. Their reputation was built on the foundation laid by those who served in Vietnam. They continue to train with methods that differ subtly but significantly from their American counterparts, maintaining traditions of patience and precision that date back to the jungle campaigns of 1962 through 1971. When Australian and American special operators work together in modern conflicts, the differences are evident to those who know what to look for. The Australians still move more quietly, wait more patiently, and strike more precisely than doctrine manuals alone can teach. Major Robert Francis Gruning would have recognized their methods instantly. They were the methods that changed his life, ended his career, and opened his eyes to truths that his own military was not ready to hear. He spent his final years compiling a personal memoir that his family has thus far declined to publish. Those who have read portions describe it as a meditation on the nature of military excellence, the cost of institutional pride, and the quiet heroism of men who mastered war by refusing to fight it on anyone's terms but their own. The jungle has long since reclaimed the trails where Gruning walked with his Australian teachers. The base at Nui Dat is now a historical site, its bunkers preserved as monuments to a war that both nations would prefer to remember selectively. The men who moved like ghosts through that green hell deserve to be remembered. Their story is one of the great hidden narratives of the Vietnam era, buried not by enemy action, but by institutional reluctance to admit that sometimes the best and brightest are not wearing American uniforms. This is the story that the Pentagon did not want you to know. This is the truth about what one American officer learned when he set aside his pride and asked the Australians to teach him. This is the legacy of the jungle ghosts who proved that war's greatest victories are sometimes won in absolute silence. And this is why, more than 50 years later, the lessons of Operation Walkabout still matter.